Welcome to another episode of Engagement That Scales with Rachel Happe. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Shannon. How are you?
I'm great. Happy Friday.
Oh, thank goodness it is Friday because it's been a long week. I think what I've noticed is this week everybody's just like finally like it's kind of sinking in that this is like I've talked to a lot of people that are just like mentally a little exhausted this week. So it's nice to have Harold here because I have not caught up in real life or even digital synchronous life with Harold Jarche in a long time. And so I think we have a lot to talk about. I think 30 minutes may challenge us to get through all of that. But Harold, if you would start off, I mean, I don't even know. I mean, we must have met online at some point, but our worlds really intersect because Harold thinks a lot about learning and networks and how your personal network and communities and bigger networks all interact to create your personal learning environment, or what do you call it? The personal
knowledge mastery.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I was like, that's not the acronym. So we obviously work kind of in analog and similar spaces, and he's just done some great work and has great diagrams about how to think about things that I've seen up on our clients' walls. So tell me what you've been up to, Harold, and like, what are you thinking about? What's going on in your world these days?
Well, I can tell you one thing that I'm not up to, and that's planning on going to Lisbon and meeting you face to face as we were supposed to do in a few weeks. So yeah, the speaking, I think is quite interesting. Is that the whole notion of public speaking is going to really be in question. And it's kind of like the travel market that I think is. Will change significantly, and I don't know if Zoom is going to replace it or something else. Not sure about that.
The idea of like I've always done a fair bit of public speaking, but I haven't made a career of public speaking, and suddenly that seems very smart because I want
yeah, it was a significant part of my professional work. And that's changed over. I've been freelancing for 17 years, and every year's been different. Some years it's a lot of consulting, other years it's a lot of training, maybe some more writing, more speaking. You know, and it is a real mix. But basically, that part of my business is pretty well dead right now. I'm doing a few things like this, mostly for marketing. And we'll kind of see where public speaking moves on that. So I have a fairly large project that's been going on for just over a year now. I'm working with a global bank and working for their collaboration unit, people responsible for collaboration across the enterprise. And so we've been doing a number of different things. And part of it, the personal knowledge mastery is part of it. We've just developed a program that we're going to be testing out in a few weeks. We'll be field testing how that goes. It's got 4 units to it, and it's practical methods of sense making, sharing knowledge, all the stuff that the PKM framework is about. And so that's pretty exciting. And then we're also looking at a number of ways of making work smarter. We're calling it working smarter, which comes from my colleague Jay Cross.
Yeah. The area that you've kind of scoped out and been thinking about, individuals are really challenged around that. And I've seen it recently because Microsoft Teams has exploded. So Team Chat has exploded. And even Microsoft doesn't entirely seem to know what to do with Yammer and communities, right? Like, how does that interact with Team Chat? And to me, what's interesting is it's pretty clear in my mind, but it's of great confusion both to those who are deploying all these technologies and the individuals trying to navigate them. So kind of talk to me a little more about like what you're seeing on that front and where you come at it.
Yeah, I think you and I sort of face the same issue, is that we're focused on the people side, and the money has traditionally gone into the technology, and quite often I've come into a project or helped to solve a problem, and the client has spent, let's say, $500,000 on the technology and that, and then they've got a budget of like $20,000 for making it work. It's like, okay. Yeah, that.
So what's interesting to me around all of that is if you look at, sometimes I think I should have been an economics major, but if you look at how value is generated in business models, it's by getting somebody to change their behavior.
Yeah.
And technology alone is not, I mean, you can force a behavior change, again, with structural force, but it's very hard, especially on the communication side, to force somebody to communicate well. So that just is not a great approach to culture change or change management or whatever in this space.
But, well, I think that one opportunity that the pandemic, the remote work from home, and has done, first of all, it sort of showed people that it can be done. A lot of people who never did it before. But it also, what I find that working with the technology, so I mean, I developed PKM and other things, it's what I call creative desperation. You know, I live in New Brunswick, Canada, in a town of 5,000 people, far away from everywhere. So I had to use the web and technologies, and, you know, in early days, blogs and wikis, and then later, you know, Twitter, and then finally some of these more community tools.
They call a lead user. And
oh yeah, well, yeah, I wasn't leading edge, I was bleeding edge, right? It was, and so, because, you know, Boston's the nearest big city to me, right? And that's 650 miles away. Or Montreal, right? Those are the two major cities, and I'm just, you know, beyond the pale on that. But I think that what this remote work people shut down has shown, first of all, is that, okay, they now understand the technology and what it does, but what remote work does is that it sort of lays bare the problems. Is that we can paste over, like when you're in a classroom teaching, we got all those human things that we can do. We've had 100,000 years of evolution we know how to deal with people face to face. We don't know how to deal with people through this stuff. We've only been doing that for, you know, maybe 20 years. And so, you know, things like having no structure for meetings. All right, that's something that becomes really evident when you're on 8 hours of Zoom. Right, it's like, maybe we should be looking at structures. The same thing about making sense, connecting to people, is that, you know, you can't just sort of chat around the water cooler. You've got to make this more explicit in how you do that. And that's pretty well what the PKM framework is it's a way of being explicit, is that seek, sense, share. Okay, who do I seek? How do I seek them? How do I connect? You know, how do I make sense of it? And then how do I share appropriately? And the sharing part becomes really critical, is having stuff to share, particularly asynchronously, which people aren't used to either.
It gets at something that, like, I share that, which is like online, everything's explicit. And so if your relationships or culture is bad, that gets exposed really quickly. Yeah. And I, being in the middle of this kind of crazy news thing that we are in the US, I keep holding on to this perspective of, you can't change what you can't see. And we can now see exactly how painful and racist and whatever we are. And some people, that just overwhelms them. And I always try and flip that and say, but we actually we can address the problem. We know who's contributing to it. We know who's involved. We can see how they use language and maybe how that indicates their mindset. And like, we can kind of like draw back to like, what is the real problem there? So I think that's the biggest opportunity in communities that organizations are not seeing, which is in the best communities, and we've seen this in our research the last couple of years, is communities are helping organizations change how they change, because they can bring people along and iteratively, incrementally make sense of what the change is and how that works for them and what that means for them and all of that.
Yeah, it's like the community tables. I think there's a movement of bringing people, having dinner together, and a lot of times outdoors at big tables and getting to know people. I mean, somebody was commenting on Twitter the other day. So you and I are active on Twitter, and I presume that you've been attacked at least once. I mean, it would be normal.
You know what? Not a lot.
Oh, you're definitely not putting yourself out there.
Well, maybe I should be more offensive.
You don't have to be offensive. You just, as a matter of fact, that's the least you need to do. But what's interesting is that usually if you get attacked by somebody who doesn't know you, you've never met. It's not very often where if you've actually had a conversation with that person, because there's a bunch of people that I know, and every once in a while I say, let's just talk, right? And so we set up a meeting, we just chat, get to know each other. And once you've made that human connection with the person, even if you violently disagree on Twitter, is that you're going to do it in a better way. And that's the difference between community and networks, right? Is that I call the social networks the Wild West, right? Everybody, all the gunslingers out there, and who knows, but that community space is that safe space. Is that you can argue. Like I belong to one community, and there's about 15 of us in there, and we have some very strong arguments. But the thing is that we all relate to each other. And so at the end of the day, we want the community to continue. Yeah. And so it doesn't get down to that mudslinging level.
And to me, that has to do with both the fact that people you don't know can kind of just interject at any time. Yeah. I usually block people if their first foray into conversation with me is argumentative. Mm-hmm. I'm like, I don't have the energy in my life for that. So like, bye.
And that's why I like Twitter, because it's very easy to block. Yeah. I mean, in spite of all the crap on Twitter, you can still pretty well make it relatively decent.
Right. But it's what I also understand. My background is in technology, and I have always found the architecture of social media technology to be oddly antisocial, because my stream is not a shared space. That's me and my like apple crate in the park screaming. Only my audience is kind of built in. Like they can't really get away unless they want to like really get away. And that's not a socially normal, meaning if you're screaming in the park and being offensive, people stay away, like they just they give you wide berth. And so we get into this weird antisocial dynamic on social media where when you share a space, when you have a community situation, you're not in your living room anymore. You're in the school, you're in.
Yeah, and like when I run my workshops, so I run these PKM workshops, and one of the things that I really get people to think about is be explicit about why are you using this technology, and is it the appropriate one for what you're trying to do. So I mean, I liken Twitter to like a cocktail party, right? You can have shallow conversation. You can't have deep conversations on Twitter. I mean, you can try the strings things. That's where you pick up the phone or something and you have the deep one. It was interesting because when Google Plus was active, there were a lot of really deep conversations on Google Plus for certain in tech, and mathematics were two areas that I saw where there were really deep, long conversations, these threads that would go on forever, and people really exchanging very nuanced ideas and stuff.
Reddit too, subreddits.
Yeah, Reddit. Some of the Reddits, if you know which one to go in, which rabbit hole not to go down.
Just cats or whatever, whatever. But yeah, it's interesting. I like Google Plus was interesting because I found it too architecturally, like it was brilliant. The architecture was brilliant, but for your average user.
Yeah, if you didn't know how to set up circles, it was a real challenge. And it's the same thing with Twitter. Is that you talk to people about lists. The other thing is if you're using the web interface to understand that the difference between latest tweets and home, and it's a huge difference if you don't use the latest. And so again, we need to understand. Just because everybody's on Facebook doesn't mean you should be on Facebook. You should be on Facebook for a reason. Yeah. And I'm not on Facebook, so hooray! For a reason. So we make those decisions. So understanding the technology, and of course it keeps changing, and so that's where communities really help. So I'm in a community with Valdis Krebs. Valdis is the organizational network analysis expert, right? And so if I have questions about that kind of stuff, I ask Valdis, right? I mean, I know a lot of people smarter than me. And I think that's the only way we're going to advance is through community. I mean, I know the CR, the work that you've been doing. I mean, when I talk to particularly people in learning and development, is that the future of learning is in community. It's building communities, supporting communities, finding communities. That's what it's all about.
My take on that, because my background is innovation management. So
Mhm.
before, like long before I ever got an online community, whatever, I was doing innovation management. And we were building co-development portals and ideation stuff back in the late 90s, right? So like
Mhm.
the second wave, I'm like, and everybody uses communities for ideation. And I'm like, no, 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 no. I mean, yes, you can, but that's not the magic. And then last year, when I was doing our research, I finally had enough data to do ROI over age.
Yeah.
And I don't know what I thought I was doing, but in the early days of the CR, I had this geometric curve that just kept going up on community value. And I don't know where it ends, like it just somewhere.
Mhm.
And last year, I started looking at the data and it looked like an innovation S curve. And I was like,
Ah.
of course. And then, you know, something that I've always thought about is the real front end of innovation. Like, what is the
Where do good ideas come from?
yeah. And what I came to is the people who actually innovate don't know they're innovating.
Yeah.
Because they didn't sit down at a table and say, I'm going to innovate today, gosh darn it.
They had an itch to scratch.
They had a problem and they solved it with whatever experience and resources they had at their disposal. And so it really takes the second person to see that and say, oh, that is really interesting. Why did you think of that?
Yeah.
And so then I was thinking even more back, and when we used to do consulting around culture, and we still do occasionally, although we don't do as much of that conversation anymore. I used to make everybody in these sessions pick from 100 pictures. And I'd say, pick 3 pictures that represent your culture to me. And doing that work, I realized the front end of innovation is art. Mm-hmm. It's emotion and art. And you express yourself through art because you don't have words. You don't have the sense, right? Like, I haven't made sense of this yet.
The artists are the closest to seeing the future.
Yeah.
That's where it comes from. Yeah.
Either it's a spark of innovation or whatever, or it's a frustration with the way things are. And it's us looking at the art in community that starts to put words and meaning, and what does that mean? And so you think about the salons in Paris. That was a community that was innovating. That was an innovation community. Silicon Valley, same thing. And so like, I combine the community with that front end of like, it allows other people to see the spark that somebody started and doesn't even realize could be applied somewhere. And it helps make collective, like, what are we all doing here? Anyways, like, that was an interesting thing. And we saw the same thing in the data this year. And I was like, of course, community innovation engines.
Yeah, there's two, I've sort of identified 2 mindsets I think that are really important in this era of who knows what your work is going to look like next year. And one is the artist's mindset. And the other one is the gamer's mindset, the hacker's mindset, somebody who tinkers and plays and, it was Einstein called it combinatory play. Right? Is that we're putting different connections and stuff together. And you're familiar with Gary Klein, psychologist. He organizational psychologist, and he wrote a really great book called Seeing What Others Don't. And he took a look at 120 case studies of where there was insight and innovation in organizations. And he took a look at them and says, well, one of these things is not like the other type stuff, and how do we put this together? And he came up with 5 different types of reasons that drove the insight, right? And there were contradictions. Okay, that's not the same. Creative desperation. That's how, PKM came out of creative desperation for me, right? And then connections. We see that, and that's the kind of stuff we're talking about. Coincidences. And curiosity. It's kind of like, well, let's just see what happens if I tweak this. Oh no, it just blew up on me. And the personal knowledge mastery framework basically helps with 3 of them, right? Curiosity, connections, and coincidences. So it's the whole notion of Ross Dawson calls it enhanced serendipity, So
Mm.
the more connections I have, right? If I stay in the house all day like I do right now, the chances of meeting somebody new are going to be really low. But if I go on public transport, which we used to be able to do, I might meet more people than taking an Uber. And so, and then the same thing digitally is that, well, if I follow people on Twitter who are not like me, I might learn something from a different perspective, right? Either different culturally, geographically, different background. It's just not all old white guys, right? And so part of the
And it gets back.
PKM framework is so the question is, how do you do that? And that's and there's a whole bunch of different ways of doing it.
It actually gets back to where we started this conversation about the hot mess that Twitter can be, which is you can't negotiate or make sense of conflict over there because you're not in a safe space and you don't have a relationship.
Yeah.
And that is critical then to innovation and making sense of your work and learning. And so you need that trusted space.
And that's Johnny Ive became the first fellow of the Oxford Cambridge Union, I think it was called, about 2 years ago, and he gave an acceptance speech. And I thought it was really interesting the way that he was talking about how they did design work at Apple, right? Is that, and he said that it's a balance between the curiosity and the resolve to solve problems, and that we're constantly, he says, it's like we go out there and we, look a butterfly, and then it's, oh, we've got a ship and let's get this done. And he said, you're doing this multiple times a day. So, those three areas that I talk about, there's the work teams who've got to be focused on getting the work done. There's the professional social networks with lots of great ideas, but kind of messy. And the community is the space in which we can get the flow of that knowledge coming in from the social networks, and that's interesting stuff, but also coming back from the work team saying, hey, this is what we did and this is what we learned, and I can talk to my peers about this. And so the communities are these safe spaces for learning, but you need all three of them. You need the Wild West, you need the safe space, and you need to get work done.
That you're getting at, Lou Woodley, who was at AAAS for a long time, and I was working with them on their communities of scientific people. She had this great blog post about how communities really negotiate tensions, right? They're the web of kind of going to the extreme and bringing it back to the middle, and where's the right landing spot.
And that's the special sauce of the community managers, right? Is that being able to identify that, working the relationships, developing the trust, closing the triangles, doing all that human, being the social convener.
Making conflict okay, and so we talk about breaking up cliques a lot, because a lot of our clients get really excited because they get a lot of activity somewhere. And I'm like, yeah, but you're exclusive. You're not bringing in any fresh information. Yeah. And so that's okay for a little bit, and it's okay if you're working on a project together, but it's not okay long term, because you're going to kind of fall into yourself and lose perspective.
Yeah. The other thing with communities that I've noticed, I don't know if this is a consistent thing with your work, is that they have a lifespan. They're kind of like people, and there are times when it's time to close it down. You see that?
That gets back to the innovation
with the S curve. Yeah.
So what happens in communities, and people try and start communities too big, and I'm like, but if it's a new idea, there's not that many people who care about it yet, and there's not a collective sense of what it means yet, and so you're going to get a smaller group of people who are wrestling with that, and not everybody wants to wrestle with that. And that's okay, because once they start to make that meaning, you get a really steep curve. And then as that gets saturated or defined or whatever, it becomes a knowledge base almost. And so either you have to put the community to bed, close the community, whatever, or find a new shared purpose for the community and say, okay, we did that work. Now what's the next thing we're going to tackle together? And sometimes the community makes sense for that, and sometimes you're like, I've got the wrong set of people in here for that next task. So yes, absolutely. Unless a community is together, I think there's communities' interests or
Yeah,
passions.
there's a whole bunch of different types of communities that become
So it's fun
basically,
what you're doing.
yeah, that's why I showed the overlapping between communities and networks and teams, because there are some that are not quite that. I mean, large communities for the most part are networks with sub communities inside them, I find. But the general network, I mean, kind of like a lot of associations, you know.
That's what I thought we were going to talk about today. We didn't really even get to it, but a lot of the work that I'm thinking about right now is designing ecosystems, right? It's not one community anymore. And the advisory work I've done for the past couple of years is not one community. It's how do you create standards and design the ecosystem so that a whole range of communities can thrive underneath it. And that kind of gets me to my last point, which is I always ask my guests for one last thing. I'm going to share mine because it's related to that, which is I've been working on this year's research. And we finally have a financial benchmark for the ROI of an individual member, which how much value do they put in, how much value do they get out? And we've been looking at internal communities, and they are so underutilized, so underutilized. The average member across all the internal communities in our benchmark or in our research have less than one answer per year contributed per member. And they're only getting 7 answers back. And I'm like, if you think of that in a work environment, you could do that in an hour, right? And now they're not work teams, they're communities, but then that's why I was looking at benchmarks for the CR network, because I was like, the CR network is a community of practice, which is probably a little more similar to a use case. And we have something like 13 answers per member per year, and they get 107 answers back. So like the differential between what's going on out in the world and we found the difference is they're not investing in community management, which is back to the beginning of our conversation. So what's the one last thing on your mind these days?
Well, I like being way out on the edge. So I think if you've read some of my stuff, you know that I'm very interested in societal shift and how we're moving from a market-dominated society to a network-dominated society. But I came across some research recently by the Long Now Foundation. You're familiar with them, and they're calling an end to the Enlightenment. And and I'm a big, I have a major in history, and so I'm kind of pro Enlightenment. I like rational, being rational, scientific, and all the good stuff that came out of the Enlightenment, not the bad stuff. And they're saying we're moving into the entanglement. And the entanglement is a number of things. One is that, and if you think about it from a complexity perspective, it makes sense. Is that it's nonlinear, and instead of breaking things down, we have to be putting things together. And the way that we put things together is that we can now start putting ideas together, but in physical reality or in silicon reality or something like that. So we can actually try different things out, different scenarios, whether with AR, VR, and all those kinds of things. And then a key part of the entanglement is humans working with software and machines. Is that we have to become better at doing that. And there's a really interesting example. MIT Review did this. They looked at Google's AI program. They field tested it in Thailand, and it was doing for eye issues with the retinas. And what happened was that the nurses would have to take a picture of it, and then it goes into the AI, and the AI would come back and say, this person has glaucoma, whatever it is, these are the chances. But the thing is that when they field tested it, most of the problems weren't with the AI. They were the quality of the pictures. They were, we can't upload to the cloud. It can't read it, which means that you don't get a result. And the nurse says, then you must be fine. And the person actually isn't fine. But what they did find out of it, there was one nurse, right, who was really good at taking the pictures, was able to upload them. She took over 1,000 of these pictures. And basically what it showed, their conclusion is that you take a really good worker who understands how to use the technology, and they've just gone up, way up there. I think that we're going to see that people who know how to use this stuff properly are going to be 10 times better than other people they're working with.
It's augmented. And I see that actually, I see that in myself, right? I have learned so much by building a network online and having a community.
Yeah.
Like, I know so much, and because I'm naturally good at synthesis, I can take all of that and make some sense out of it, where other people get really overwhelmed some of the time.
Yeah, you got to do it. The whole, you can't just talk about the stuff. I mean, the whole academic model, which is going to be really in question coming here soon, whether even schools reopen. Well, they might reopen, but maybe nobody's going to go to them.
Yeah.
I mean, if I had university age children right now, it would be, I think you can take a gap year. And see that. So yeah, there's going to be some interesting stuff. So yeah, the notion of entanglement, the notion, other people called it the new sphere. There's a whole bunch of different terms for this, and it's and sort of post nationalism. You know, I mean, because right now the best cooperation happening in the world is amongst scientific medical researchers. They're not even asking permission to their governments. They're sharing. They're open sourcing it. They're getting the stuff out there.
Also, like, it's interesting that you mentioned the schools, because one of the things that is impressed me is my daughter's school has a director of community, because they see their whole thing is self-directed learning, and so the trust in the classroom community is what allows that to flourish. And so it's a really interesting thing. I think that's a great point to end on. But Harold, this was a fabulous catch up.
I like this. I'm glad we got to talk. Well, next time we'll do it on stage somewhere.
Yeah, Barcelona, here we come.
Okay.
In 2025 or whenever we're allowed to do that again.
Yeah, I'll be there for my 100th birthday or something.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Rachel.
Delightful, and have a fabulous weekend, but not in Nova Scotia.
We have snow coming.
Oh, yeah, we do too.
Yeah. Oh well, I'll be on the bike sometime. Let's try it and see.
Okay, take care.
Okay, you too. Bye bye.